do know that unfortunately these conversion practices will continue and the sermons will continue. So we do need to be extremely diligent and alert in this place to the very real potential of what will happen now in terms of what practices will be driven underground. However, despite what the Greens have identified, and I think others have identified but have actually been urged to not make a fuss about it, I'll be putting that on the record, despite what we have identified as a key weakness to this legislation and disappointing aspect of it, it is still a very significant step in the path to full equality for the LGBTQIA+ community, because the archaic and cruel practice of conversion therapy will be banned, with hopefully what will be the passing of this bill tonight, or this morning actually. And survivors and advocates and their supporters will be celebrating tonight, or when they wake up tomorrow and they hear the news, hopefully that this bill has passed. And that is a very wonderful thing. But then after the celebrations, there is more to do. There is always more to do. For example, our weak self-identification laws in this state, which mean that people are still required to undergo surgery to change their gender on official documents such as driver's licence. We need to commit to being back in this place in the not too distant future to fix that, and to continue to bring forward legislation to ensure everyone is protected equally under the law, regardless of sexuality, gender or gender identity.
Honourable Jackie Munro.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant President. I rise to support the bill, and as has been foreshadowed by my colleague, the Honourable Damien Tudor-Hope, we will be moving amendments that we think will strengthen the bill. In considering this bill, I was reminded of the first gay wedding that I ever attended. It was the perfect union of faith and love. It was held at the Uniting Church on Pitt Street, and it was with two very old dear friends, David and Curtis, who I'd known since uni, around the time that they had started dating. It was a fabulous wedding, and I had the incredible privilege of singing in the choir for that wedding, and to be called out at the reception for the very small part that I played in the marriage equality campaign. And it was a celebration of individual expression, of love, and of their commitment to their religion in front of their loved ones and the community. When I met them is around the time that I first came out. My public coming out was on the second night of O Week at the University of Sydney. It was at the event Coming Out by Candlelight, where we legally graffitied the graffiti tunnel, and I spray painted "Bisexuals have more fun" and took a photo of it and put it on Facebook. I got 3 likes on that post, but in that demonstration that there was very little fanfare in me coming out, I actually felt good, because my sexuality actually didn't matter all that much, because really, who cares? And the answer is that some people care too much. Some people care too much about other people's sexuality, and there are people who care about that sexuality in a damaging and detrimental way. This bill is designed to help all people to feel confident that their right to express themselves and be safe in their identity is respected, that it is okay to expect that one's sexuality is one's own business. When I ran for the seat of Sydney against Tanya Plibersek, I publicly made it clear that I don't really like identity politics, though I was comfortable disclosing my sexuality, because I'm fearful of the division that it can create. But I also said that I'm happy to share my story as just one of many stories in this city, because stories are what make us human. Our stories give us the ability to connect. And although I actually dislike the phrase, you can't be what you can't see, because you should feel free to be exactly what you can't see as long as you're not harming anyone, there is value in connection and cohesion through finding core human similarities. Survivors courageously sharing their stories, and families and faith groups alike, allow us to get to a place that is closer together, of understanding and not caring in appropriate measure. Because people caring too much is leading to terrible mental health outcomes. The Sydney Morning Herald reported last month, with ABS data recently released, that Australians with diverse sexualities and gender identities are 2 to 4 times more likely to experience a mental health disorder, suicidal thoughts and self-harm than the broader population. In every instance, LGBTQ Australians had higher levels of mental distress than the remainder of the population. 64% of lesbian and gay people had experienced a mental disorder, such as depression or anxiety, in their lifetime, as had 80% of bisexual people and 93% of those who used a different term. This compared with 42% of heterosexual Australians. As a member of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual plus community, and the New South Wales Liberals' first openly LGBTQI+ woman in Parliament, I am hopeful that the kind of mutable characteristics that have previously been denigrated, including in this place, can be recognised as valuable to the depth of lawmaking in New South Wales and Australia, and to the depth of Australian society. On the 2nd of May 1962, in the other place, a matter was discussed which included a member raising the reality at the time that homosexual provocation would downgrade murder to manslaughter. In the late 70s, a standard template petition was tabled in Parliament many times, tweaked according to the group's petitioning, urging members to oppose any changes in our state's laws which would legalise and/or encourage the following activities. Firstly, the adoption of children by homosexual or lesbian partners, and then acts of sodomy in private or public. The petition was in response to a bill before Parliament at the time, the Anti-Discrimination Bill. Petitioners sought the deletion of a number of sections which appeared to be in direct conflict with existing state laws which clearly define homosexual acts as unlawful conduct and could enforce the acceptance of homosexuality in the Army, Navy, Air Force, the education system, police force, etc. It also sought to delete sections from a motion by the Honourable John Dowd, Liberal member for Lane Cove and future leader of our party at the time, for fear it would lead to the legalisation of sodomy. I note that this was one of the earliest attempts to decriminalise homosexual sex. The Honourable John Dowd attempted to introduce a private member's bill, but Dowd's bill was never introduced into Parliament as the Labor government voted against it, being included on the parliamentary notice paper. Back to the petitioners, who further requested that the government establish a special department within the New South Wales Health Commission to A, develop humane methods of helping persons to overcome or deal with homosexual tendencies through counselling, psychological and medical assistance. Well, we know what that looks like, and we've heard descriptions of what that has done in the chamber tonight. They also rather generously, I thought, finally asked the government to conduct a vigorous campaign to combat the serious VD epidemic, particularly amongst practising male homosexuals. These were illiberal requests to make of Parliament, antithetical to a free society that values the role of loving families and individuals. This is the type of fear-mongering that has occurred for decades, perhaps centuries in Australia, against the acceptance and inclusion of non-heterosexual people. Honestly, what are people worried about? Thankfully, what people consensually do in their own bedrooms is now legal. In 1984, New South Wales Parliament passed a private member's bill to decriminalise consensual sex between men. The Liberal Party, under then opposition leader Nick Greiner, supported a conscience vote, which enabled the legislation to pass Parliament. It was the former member for Bligh, Michael Yabsley, along with Nick Greiner, who spoke in support of decriminalising homosexual acts between men. But campaigns like this still exist, these fear-mongering campaigns. They may not be so overt because the Overton window has shifted. It is important for me to name, celebrate and honour the courage of people in my Liberal Party who are able to overcome discrimination, difference and denigration to represent Australians in Parliament and therefore in policy. People who have given voice to values that have moved the Overton window closer to a society that represents individual expression and freedom, these liberal values, to help us get to where we are today. The first openly gay man elected to the other place was a Liberal in 2011, with Bruce Notley Smith making history. Trent Zimmerman, former member for North Sydney, was the first openly gay man elected to the House of Representatives in 2015. The first openly gay woman to represent a major party in the House of Representatives was a Liberal, Angie Bell, in 2019. And before her, I must note, because although not a Liberal Party member, she is a former boss and a mentor, Dr. Karen Phelps was the first openly lesbian and incidentally Jewish woman elected to the House of Representatives. Dr. Phelps and her wife, Jackie Stricker Phelps, were before that instrumental in changing our state's laws to permit same-sex couples to adopt children. It was thanks to the tireless advocacy of the Honourable Don Harwin, former Minister and President of this place, that the Liberal Party supported a conscience vote on adoption rights for same-sex couples. It was the Liberal Party under Nick Greiner that committed to bring all issues relating to gay discrimination under the Anti-Discrimination Act. While Greiner's successor, John Fay, decided not to fulfil that commitment, it was a Liberal MLC, Ted Pickering, who crossed the floor, enabling the legislation to pass Parliament. I also pay tribute to former Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Chris Pulplick, AM, who has worked throughout his life to advance LGBTQI rights. He made a lengthy submission in 2012 to the Senate Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs into the Marriage Equality Amendment Bill 2010. The Liberals in New South Wales announced a special commission of inquiry into historical gay hate crimes, thanks to the advocacy of former member of this place, Shane Mallard, obviously amongst other members. The Liberal Party also committed to establishing the first state-funded LGBT health centre. And in 2023, the Liberal Party announced its support for laws to ban gay conversion therapy under the leadership of Premier Dom Perrottet. Tonight, as Liberals supporting the bill on the second read, we are part of another important step toward protecting individual expression and liberty while recognising freedom of faith. And I wanted to note Menzies' contribution to the diversity of faith and our diverse society. He said in 1942, "We are a diversity of creatures with a diversity of minds and emotions and imaginations and faiths. When we claim freedom of worship, we claim room and respect for all." And I note, of course, that while these achievements that I've listed have included Liberal members, they obviously included many members of this place from a range of different parties. And it's about that collaboration and working together that makes progress in these areas so valuable and special. The bill before us tonight seeks to strengthen the protections for individuals in New South Wales to feel safe and accepted. They honour the Liberal tenet of individual freedom. They are protections, bans to gay conversion therapy that have already been granted in Tasmania, Victoria and Queensland. Because sexuality should not be a cause for division or denigration. It should not be a source of fear and rejection. This bill represents a confirmation from this Parliament that maliciously seeking to change another person's sexual orientation or gender identity is not okay. We have come a long way since the crime of sodomy and the gay panic defence. I spoke about the Overton window in my inaugural speech, how the socially and politically acceptable shifts over time. Marriage equality, delivered under a Liberal Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, was an important step in helping to end discrimination in Australia. Senator Dean Smith's bill passed the federal parliament in 2017, allowing for marriages from the 9th of January 2018. And again, this is not an achievement that is owned by the Liberal Party. Of course, it is a result of hundreds and thousands of like-minded people working together to make this country a better place for all. And marriage equality demonstrated a further shift in the Overton window. The sky did not fall in, and we came closer to realising the statements of belief articulated by the Liberal Party in our We Believe statement. In the inalienable rights and freedoms of all people, in those most basic freedoms of parliamentary democracy, the freedom of thought, worship, speech and association. These principles are further progressed under this conversion practices ban bill. And I want to read a passage from Faith, Love and Australia, the Conservative Case for Same-Sex Marriage, written by Paul Ritchie, in the context of the marriage equality debate. He said that true conservatism is a temperament. It has a quiet dignity that carries people with it, because it knows that it is the social fabric that binds us together. To mock my neighbour, to decry his values, is ultimately to weaken myself. It is a philosophy grounded in humility, because the conservative tradition understands that humanity is frailer than we like to imagine or care to admit. We see our lives for what they are, fragile and all too short. We know that mostly our hopes, our loves, our losses, and our very lives are not ours to control. At times, this makes us cling to the past when we should loosen our grip, forego change when we ought to embrace it, or clutch to a certainty when we might let it go, because we know that the future is not assured. I think it's highly relevant in this context. Richie's book was a significant contribution to liberal conservative thought. It is through expression and conversation that his appeal to shared values could be made reality. Reading, talking, and curiosity are essential. Asking questions, having the courage to listen, answering questions, and letting go of limiting fears about judgment are behaviours that require ongoing practice. At the time of the marriage equality campaign, I hadn't realised how much I'd denied myself the vision of a future where I had a wife, which is now possible. I didn't fully understand how that national conversation would impact me personally. After leading the Irish Yes vote to victory and standing on the precipice of a history-making Australian campaign, Tiernan Brady suggested to me that I wouldn't fully appreciate the change to Australian law until perhaps years later. He was right. I hope that tonight's bill, once passed, will give people the same sense of freedom to explore and enjoy their identity that I felt when marriage equality passed. The bill is not perfect, and perhaps no piece of legislation is. It is challenging to legislate for extremely human issues. Previous speakers have spoken eloquently about the relationships between health, family, parents, proportionality, religion, the right to practice faith, the right to individual expression and liberty. As I said, we'll be moving amendments on this side of the House to try to strengthen the bill to address those levels of proportionality that we think have not been addressed appropriately in this bill. But the criminal bar is high, and that is important. The civil procedures that exist in this bill also allow for conciliation of growth and progress between people. I want to acknowledge the courage and leadership of a number of Liberals who I haven't named yet: Federal Senator for New South Wales, Andrew Bragg, Christine Forster, and my contemporary in this place, the Honourable Chris Rath. I want to thank Clark Cooley, Maya Edge, Patrick Wynne and Chris Pulplick and the New South Wales Liberal Pride Group for compiling the list of Liberal LGBTQI+ achievements. So importantly, I want to say thank you to those who have come to me with concerns, honestly, openly and in good faith about this bill. I believe that there are important questions to answer, and these matters will be explored further, but without this open and honest and respectful debate, we can't make progress. I thank members for respectful debate in this chamber and in the other place. Former Australian Senator Scott Ryan wrote an essay at the conclusion of his 14-year term. In Challenging Politics, he talks about the increasing tendency of people with differing views to impugn motives of their opponents. He said, "It is now much more common for motives to be assigned, impugned and attacked than for a conversation to be had about specific measures or outcomes." So I wanted to note the respectful manner in which this debate has occurred. We all come to this place with the desire to protect rights and liberties, even though they of course sometimes conflict. We come here with the respect and understanding that we are all trying to make Australia a better place. For those who celebrate sexuality and those who denigrate it, surely there is a sensible place that we can get to where we are not defined by our sexuality, where we are not treated differently because of our immutable characteristics. But that is not yet the case, and that is why this bill is so important. Because there are still places in our society where children and young people are told that they are less than, that they are wrong, sinful, broken, unworthy of love as they are. I want to say a final thank you to the advocates and survivors for sharing their stories. This bill, of course, belongs to you. I acknowledge those survivors of gay conversion therapy and advocates who have worked for months and for years on this bill and this movement. This bill truly does belong to you. Tonight we can say to people across New South Wales experiencing concern, fear, indecision about your sexuality or gender, that you are more welcome in society than ever before, welcome just as you are. Feel no pressure to be a certain way because of outside influence. Consider your identity and sense of self with compassion and curiosity. It is worth taking the time to explore who you are without labels or constraints. You have a whole lifetime to do it in so many ways. There is hope, and the best is yet to come.
Thank you. The Honourable Rod Roberts.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, I rise to speak to the Conversion Practices Ban Bill 2024. And Mr President, I rise to oppose this bill. I speak as a member of this House and as a parent. I oppose this bill as it intrudes on parental rights and places our children at the whims of their feelings and the whispers of the leftist ideologues. Being a parent is not easy, and it's getting harder. Today, parents have the difficult task of guiding their child through a rapidly changing world, made all the more confusing by social media and the thousands of competing voices, all seeking to shape children in their own image and win them to their cause. Yet this bill in its current form criminalises a parent who wishes to protect their child from this undue influence of others. Mr President, no government can love a child more than their parents could love them. And as a parent, love often takes the form of the word no, and subsequently setting of healthy boundaries. Think of the many times a parent has had to say no to their child. They do so out of love because what the child was requesting was not the best for them at that point in time. This is what responsible parenting looks like. And in fact, the Department of Community and Justice agrees. The DCJ has published a piece online that outlines parental duties and rights. It states, and I quote in part, "Parents have the duty to protect their children's rights until they are old enough to make their own way in the world. Family law in Australia defines the responsibilities that parents have in relation to bringing up their children. These include to protect your child from harm, to provide safety, supervision and control, and to provide medical care." End of quote. Despite this statement from the government, this bill legislates that parents will only be permitted to discuss matters relating to sexual orientation or gender identity with their children. One of the most important topics in life and life-altering decisions, a parent is restricted by the government to a simple series of discussions that must end with the words, "Yes, I love you and know what's best for you in this instance, but it's an offence for me to prevent you from choosing to undergo medical treatment." Mr President, there are no protections in this bill for parents who wish to offer further guidance or exercise their duty of parental authority provided to their children that aligns with the parent's own belief. This flies in the face of the fact that good parenting is about setting appropriate boundaries on the behaviours of their children, such as whose car they hop into, what time they need to be home by, or at what age they sleep over at a friend's place. The good parental practice of saying and enforcing no, not until you're older, has prevented many young people, probably myself included, from making terrible mistakes. The old saying, "Prevention is better than cure," stands true. Parents need to be able to set rules and standards for their family, not simply discuss the topic of sexual identity, because children and teens are dependent on their parents' guidance and advice, not just discussions on important issues. This bill seeks to strip away those rights and responsibilities from parents, as it effectively criminalises the loving actions of parents who wish their children to not undertake life-altering medical interventions. Queensland however, respects and recognises the important role of parental guidance in their conversion therapies chapter of the Public Health Act 2005, as it is only health service providers that are prohibited from performing conversion therapy on another person. Queensland parents are not censured and are free to choose what medical and psychological treatments is best for their family. Why not here in New South Wales, I ask? The research on the developing brain clearly shows that cognitive decision-making areas of the brain does not mature until the mid-20s. And this concept is enshrined in the common law principle of Dolle Incapax and the age of criminal responsibility. Now, we've discussed that at length some time earlier, Mr President, in relation to another bill, and this is what really confuses me. Indeed, the leftist social engineers in this place have strictly argued that the age of criminal responsibility must be raised. And why is that? It's in part due to the mental development. I quote a recent press release from the Greens. Medical and legal experts are in fierce agreement that children are developmentally incapable of criminal responsibility and the age should be raised. Again, an argument we heard in this very chamber tonight. But, Mr President, here's the contradiction, and they're always strong in the left side of politics. In one breath, they brazenly state that young offenders are unable to distinguish between the simple truths of right and wrong due to their lack of mental development. Yet, in the very next breath, these people will stand here and tell you, unashamedly proclaim that these same youths know better than their parents, peers and elders and have the mental faculties to intelligently navigate the serious decision-making required to irreparably change their hormones and body. And I'll let you just think about that for a moment. Stuff that we've heard here tonight. This contradiction is sitting in the words of the bill too. This bill states that a person under 18 cannot commit the offence of providing or delivering a conversion practice to an individual. Now, I assume that this is because the drafters of the bill believe that they are not of an age to know right from wrong. But bizarrely, a person under 18 can consent to gender treatment that will irreparably alter their bodies, ignorant to know the law, but apparently wise enough to do what they want with their bodies. And if people like Alex Greenwich and this government get their way, their parents will have no say in the matter. So I urge members of this chamber to join with me in standing up for the rights of parents, to reject government interference in how we lovingly raise our children and oppose this bill.
The Honourable Chris Rath. Thank you, Mr President. I would like to start with a story about my uncle. Uncle Jeffrey is left-handed. He grew up in Wollongong in the 1960s and 70s and went to a Catholic primary school. Back then, it was viewed as wrong and abnormal and an ailment to be left-handed. He was forced to write with his right hand, and every time he reverted to what felt natural to him, the Franciscan nuns who taught him would hit him over the knuckles with a ruler. The pain of that 8-year-old child crying every night to his parents because he was being forced to be something that he was not has no doubt caused some psychological harm to my uncle. Now, we know today that there is indeed nothing wrong with being left-handed at all. Well, this is exactly what it's like to be gay. You're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with you. You are a gift from God and the creative work of His Spirit. And just as bullying a child into writing with their right hand does not work, nor does gay conversion therapy, all of the evidence emphatically proves that gay conversion therapy does not work. And even if such traumatic practices temporarily change behaviour, this is merely fleeting, just as anyone being tortured would say or do anything to end the pain. True equality will be reached when being gay is viewed as no differently to being left-handed. This bill is for Eamon, who was sent to a psychologist to treat same-sex attraction until he refused to go. He attempted suicide on his 18th birthday. This bill is for Tim, who was sent to a clinic where hypnotherapy was used to try and cure him of same-sex attraction. He was psychologically damaged for years, but luckily he refused to give in to the bullying of being sent to a conversion therapy camp. This bill is for Jeremy, who cried all the way to and from his psychiatric sessions that were coordinated by his parents, his tutor, and his priest. He was coerced into believing that he must never act on his attraction to other boys or ever come out. These are all real stories, Mr. President, and all were reported in the Sydney Morning Herald only a few months ago. It is little wonder then it is why depression and suicide rates are so much higher among our LGBT young people than the rest of the population. They need to be protected and cared for, not bullied or tormented into being something that they're not. For these reasons and many others, I wholeheartedly support the principle of banning harmful gay conversion practices. However, it must also be done in a way that protects religious freedom and parental rights. For me, the starting point of such a bill should be the harm principle, as espoused by that great classical liberal thinker, John Stuart Mill. You should be free to do whatever you want, so long as you don't harm the life, liberty, or property of someone else. But why? Why can't I harm you or use you for my own ends? Well, that rests on a notion even greater than the harm principle itself. I can't harm you because you have intrinsic worth, you have human dignity, and you are made in the image of God. So when it comes to gay conversion practices, my starting point is to outlaw anything that results in physical or psychological harm. Now, simply being offended is not psychological harm. There is a huge difference. Prayer, sermons, Bible studies, parents having conversations with their children, and other statements of faith may offend certain people, but that is not good enough of a reason to obliterate freedom of speech and worship by censoring such views out of existence. Working in this chamber with the vast spectrum of political views on offer, I am often offended. But so bloody what? What you're saying, by saying you're offended, is nothing more than a whinge. It gives you no extra rights and removes no rights from the person supposedly making the offensive remark. As an example, a priest who calls homosexuality a sin in a sermon and offends a gay member of the congregation is not engaging in gay conversion therapy, since he has no intention of targeting and converting that member of the congregation, and he is not causing any psychological harm, merely offence. This type of religious freedom is protected in this bill. However, if hypothetically that same priest persistently called a 14-year-old boy into his office and berated him for hours about his sexuality, causing severe diagnosable psychological harm, then that type of conversion practice should definitely be banned. And thankfully under this bill it is, as legal action could be sought via either civil or criminal proceedings. It is important to note that civil proceedings in this bill can only be undertaken with the consent of the complainant and not via activists with anonymous tip-offs to the tribunal. However, as an additional safeguard, perhaps a threshold of harm should also be required for civil proceedings. The debate around this bill in both chambers and in our parties has been centred on essentially one thing: getting the balance right. The balance is, of course, between banning harmful conversion practices at one end while protecting religious freedom and parental rights at the other. The general rule is that everyone thinks they have got the balance right, and indeed I am no exception to that rule. If I had been drafting the bill, I personally would have included additional protections in line with the bill brought forward by the Tasmanian Liberal government. I support many of the additional protections being proposed as amendments to this bill by credible faith groups. And in particular, I'd like to thank Freedom for Faith, Mike Southern and Bishop Michael Stead for their eminently reasonable approach. I know this process has been as hard for you as it has been for us legislators. But by having a seat at the table and working collaboratively with the government, you have landed on a very moderate bill in comparison to what could have been the far more radical Victorian model, and you should be incredibly proud of that. I may have more to say about the amendments during the committee stage. Many are good, some are dreadful, some I will suck up and begrudgingly vote the party line because I'm a team player. I also want to make the very important point that no credible faith group, privately or publicly, has asked us to vote down this bill. There is no such request. The only request is to try to improve an already fairly moderate bill with further amendments. I'm also incredibly grateful that the Liberal Party has not descended into a culture war on this issue. The LGBT community is sick of being used as a political punching bag by people who want to divide society for electoral gain. But in addition to that, culture wars are so unbelievably dumb, as they don't produce the electoral benefits that people think they will. Just ask Scott Morrison, who lost government and almost all our once safe inner city seats. Catherine Deves bashing up on transgender kids didn't pick us up any extra votes in Western Sydney, but it certainly lost us votes in what are now Teal seats. Fortunately, in this place, the Liberal Party still holds our northern and eastern seats in Sydney, precisely because we have avoided that sort of brand of unintellectual, gut reaction, nasty, divisive, alt-right politics. Mr. President, I'd like to provide some thoughts on being one of only 7 LGBT legislators in this parliament and one of only 2 in the Liberal Party, along with my good friend Jackie Munro, and great contribution just before Jackie. It's not easy being in our position, especially in a right-of-centre political party. This is only the second time I've ever spoken about my sexuality in this parliament, the first being in my inaugural speech 2 years ago. And that's probably because I think that being gay is the least interesting thing about me, and I don't want to be defined solely by it. But even still, I can't ignore the fact that I've experienced homophobia in the Liberal Party. I lived a lie for the first 29 years of my life because I thought that coming out would hurt my political career. More recently, when I was seeking pre-selection and putting my brochure together that we all do, I was told not to include a photo with my partner as it would cost me votes. It's funny how straight male politicians are so keen to include photos with their wives to humanise them, but we are told not to rub it in people's faces. I didn't choose to be gay, Mr. President, but I wasted what should have been the best years of my life, 18 to 29, completely in the closet, trying to be something I was not. I was not happy. I was not living my best life. This bill we pass tonight may not be frequently used, but even still, the message that it sends to the community is a powerful one, a message that I wish I had heard back when I was 18. True equality will be reached when the truly gruelling experience of coming out is finally redundant. I look to Gen Z with so much optimism in that regard. They don't have to come out, they just are. I know that in many ways I disappoint everyone with my views on this topic. I'm never going to be the darling of the Australian Christian lobby or Equality Australia. I'm gay, I'm a practicing Christian, and I'm a Liberal. But throughout this debate, I've genuinely tried to delve deep into my conscience to reflect on how, as legislators, we can best ban harmful conversion practices while protecting parental choice and freedom of speech and religion. Finally, I'd like to thank Alex Greenwich for initiating this important reform, the government for drafting the legislation with broad consultation, and the Parliament for securing the bipartisanship that is needed for the passage of this bill. We should celebrate how far we have come as a society. The way that gay people were treated in the not-too-distant past was appalling. To think that homosexuality was illegal until 1984, and that those who marched in the first Mardi Gras in 1978 were bashed and arrested by the police simply for being gay, to today, where we have marriage equality and where, very shortly, an end to harmful conversion practices. As difficult as my journey has been, it certainly was much easier for me than it would have been for those who came before me. And it will be easier still for the next generation. And this bill will make sure that it is.
Thank you. The Honourable Emma Hurst.
Thank you, Mr President. On behalf of the Animal Justice Party, I rise to lend my full support to this bill. It's hard to believe that conversion practices are still legal in New South Wales, and I absolutely support banning these practices with urgency. I applaud the government for bringing this bill before Parliament, and I congratulate the member for Sydney for his dedication and tireless work on this important issue. I also want to thank the advocacy of Equality Australia in developing this legislation, and other groups and individuals who champion compassion and inclusion for all, such as the team from the Black Dog Institute who reached out to raise awareness about this important bill. Conversion practices have no place in an inclusive society. The notion that anyone should change, suppress, or hide their gender identity or sexual orientation is not only degrading but also profoundly harmful. As a former psychologist, I know how dangerous this kind of oppression can be. The rates of suicide, suicidal ideation and self-harm are heartbreakingly high. It is a tragedy that conversion practices have led many people to feel as though they are broken when we know that they are not. This view is shared by leading experts with strong backing for a ban from the Australian Medical Association, the Australian Psychological Society, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists and the Australian College of Mental Health. Conversion practices fly in the face of contemporary knowledge about health, psychiatry, emotional well-being and, of course, human rights. The outcome of these practices can end up harming people in deeply painful and long-lasting ways, with the trauma suffered by the individual often felt in the wider community as well. I acknowledge the reports from victim survivors who speak of the acute distress, ongoing and severe health issues, complex chronic trauma as a result of their exposure to conversion therapies. The testimonies and stories from community members who are connected with or have experienced conversion practices are powerful, and I encourage you to all read them. Make no mistake, these practices may sound archaic, but they still occur. Research from the Human Rights Law Centre and La Trobe University reported that up to 10% of LGBT Australians are vulnerable to conversion practices. These practices can take form in many different ways, sometimes disguising themselves as innocuous offerings of support. But whether it's presented as medical treatment or counselling or whatever form, we need to be wary of any attempt to reject a person's identity. People from the LGBTQI+ community have faced a long history of discrimination, prejudice and injustice. Shamefully, this isn't only history. Discrimination and rejection are still rife. Many individuals feel the weight of this undue stigma and may be more vulnerable to conversion practices or adversely pressured into giving their consent to these practices. There is overwhelming testimony to show that consent in these situations is rarely given freely or without undue pressure or influence. So the fight for full recognition and equality continues today, and the need for this bill cannot be understated. This bill represents something very positive. It seeks only to help people, and ultimately, this is a bill that will also save lives. So it's very simple. If a bill can achieve greater happiness without harming anyone, then why wouldn't you support it? This Parliament should have zero tolerance for homophobia and transphobia, and I express my strong opposition to any homophobic or transphobic amendments proposed by members in this House. We need an inclusive and respectful society for all. In banning conversion practices, this bill takes us one step closer to that society. To quote Alex Greenwich speaking last night in the other place, everyone should feel affirmed and welcome, regardless of who they are and who they love. Conversion practices are already prohibited in Victoria and the ACT, with a number of other jurisdictions making commitments to do the same. I welcome these laws in New South Wales, and I thank all who played a role in bringing this bill before the House. Thank you to the government for taking a stand and to protect and respect people in New South Wales. Again, I want to recognise the member for Sydney for his tireless dedication to this issue. Alex Greenwich and Tammy Narden, you make a formidable team and that I trust innately to fight for equality. Thank you. You are both saving lives and making a real difference to so many people. And I know many people have been by your side. To Anna Brown, Ghassan Kasasaya, and the team from Equality Australia, Anthony Van Brown, and ambassadors and Bridge Builders International, Chris Carbs, and Sojus survivors, and Nathan Despot of the Brave Network. Your advocacy has been essential. To all the activists who have spent decades campaigning and raising awareness of harmful conversion practices, thank you. With the passing of this bill, New South Wales becomes a safer and more welcoming place for all.
Thank you. The Honourable John Ruddock.
Mr. President, I want to put on the record that the Libertarian Party radically supports a free society and the principle of voluntary association. We therefore do not believe the state should outlaw counselling of any nature. So yes, we support individuals or institutions offering a counselling service that attempts to convince people that they are not same-sex attracted or that they are not transgender. Now, of course, we do not support conversion practices that involve physical assault or mental anguish, but those acts are already crimes. I am personally sceptical of the success of counselling efforts regarding same-sex attraction, but if people want to give it a go, we do not want the heavy hand of the state forbidding free citizens engaging in a mutually agreed private arrangement. If some want to run a public relations campaign and alert the community to what they believe are the dangers of this form of counselling, then they should be free to do that as well. The Libertarian Party was the first political party in Australia to support same-sex marriage. It was in our founding constitution in 2000, before the Labor Party and before the Greens and well before popular culture. In fact, Libertarian parties all around the world were usually the first mover in that debate. We took that view because we believe in maximising individual freedom. For the same reason today, we oppose the state criminalising voluntary association around counselling for being same-sex attracted or transgender. Now, the opposition has criticisms of this bill over process and procedure. I share those concerns, but of greater significance, I oppose this bill on fundamental principle. I oppose the further extension of the state and its threat of violence into private voluntary arrangements, and I'll have more to say on an amendment.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Rachel Merton.
Thank you. Mr. President, I contribute to debate on the Conversion Practices Ban Bill 2024. I say at the outset that harmful conversion practices should be brought to an end. It was the commitment of the Liberal National Government early last year. To be clear, conversion practices like electric shock treatment, drug treatment or other such unacceptable physical or psychological interventions are wrong. They have no place in New South Wales. We all share that commitment. While this bill sets out to ban these unacceptable practices, it significantly endangers the foundational rights of religious freedom and parental authority here in New South Wales. As a representative of religious faith, representing communities that also include those of deep religious faith, I express my profound concerns and propose necessary amendments to preserve these essential freedoms. This bill as drafted defines conversion practice in a manner that is excessively broad and ambiguous, risking the criminalisation of traditional religious teachings and pastoral care. Faith leaders across our state have voiced their apprehension, noting that the bill's vague language around terms such as suppression could extend to basic religious activities like prayer, counselling, or even discussing moral values. Such a sweeping scope is not only unprecedented but also unjust, as it infringes upon our constitutional right to religious expression. Let us be clear, this is a proposed ban on speech, on religious freedoms, and on parental authority. Our religious teachings, which guide the moral and ethical standards of countless individuals in our community, should not be hastily labelled as harmful conversion practices. It is imperative to distinguish between coercive and non-coercive religious expressions. While we unequivocally oppose any form of coercion or harm, the bill fails to adequately protect voluntary religious counselling and spiritual guidance, which are integral to our faith. Moreover, the bill's approach to gender identity and sexual orientation lacks the nuance necessary to address the complex realities faced by individuals experiencing gender dysphoria. Prominent organisations such as Women's Forum Australia, led by my very courageous and very good friend Rachel Wong, have highlighted the potential harms of affirmation-only approach, advocating for a more balanced and evidence-based treatment protocol. Ignoring the diversity of opinions and emerging scientific evidence on this subject not only undermines the bill's credibility, but also jeopardises the well-being of those it intends to protect. The Australian Christian Lobby has pointed out that the bill's premise contradicts emerging scientific evidence that the core tenets of Christian faith. The notion that the bill is based on that conversion practices stem from the belief that LGBTQ plus individuals are broken is a rotten misrepresentation of religious teaching on human nature and redemption. Our faith emphasises that all individuals, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, are valued and worthy of respect and love. To suggest otherwise is ignorant and narrow-minded. Furthermore, the bill's current exemptions for religious practices are utterly insufficient and create a legal ambiguity that could lead to the penalisation of religious leaders for practising their faith. The circular definitions and conditions within these exemptions render them ineffective, offering no real protection for religious teachings and practices. The sanctity of religious freedom is a cornerstone of our liberal democratic society. As such, it mandates our vigilant defence against any legislation that might encroach upon this fundamental right. This bill threatens to grind down this liberty, essential to the very fabric of our community. Protecting religious freedom is not merely about safeguarding the rights of the faithful to worship, it extends to preserving the lived expression of faith through teachings, counselling, and the communal practices that embody our beliefs and values. When we speak of religious freedom, we invoke the comprehensive right of individuals and communities to live out their faith in both private and public spheres, without undue interference or restrictions from government. This right underpins the diversity and harmony of our society, allowing for a variety of beliefs and practices to coexist, enriching our cultural landscape. Need I remind the House of our diverse culture and religious landscape? Its variety and our tolerance for so many religions to coexist is one of the defining aspects of why so many choose to call Australia home. Any legislative action that does not clearly and explicitly protect these expressions of faith risks diminishing the vibrancy and resilience of our religious institutions and communities. We must ensure that the bill is reframed to unequivocally uphold and safeguard the right to religious freedom, thereby honouring our commitment to a society that values and respects diverse expressions of faith and conviction. Parental rights are also at stake under this bill. The right of parents to discuss and guide their children's moral and religious upbringing is a fundamental principle that must be upheld. The bill's limited and flimsy recognition of parental discussion fails to encompass the full spectrum of parental guidance and education, thereby threatening the very fabric and value and meaning of family life. We must consider the diversity of family structures in our society. The bill's provisions must be inclusive, recognising not only biological parents but also legal guardians, adoptive parents, others who fulfil parental roles. These caregivers must be afforded the same rights and protections to guide and influence the children under their care, consistent with their moral and religious beliefs. Furthermore, the evolving social and cultural landscape, including the increased prevalence of complex issues related to gender identity and sexual orientation, necessitates a clear legal framework that supports parents in their vital role. As societal norms and scientific understanding evolve, so should our legislation, ensuring parents have the clarity and confidence to support their children through complex issues without fear of legal repercussions. In consideration, it is imperative that the bill be amended to safeguard parental rights more explicitly. This includes a broader definition of parental activities, extending beyond mere discussion to encompass all aspects of moral and religious upbringing. Additionally, the legislation should explicitly recognise the diverse range of parental and guardianship arrangements in contemporary society, ensuring all who bear parental responsibility are equally protected under the law. By affirming and protecting these rights, we not only uphold the sanctity of the family, but also ensure children can grow and thrive and live within a nurturing environment, guided by those who know and care for them best. As we deliberate on the Conversion Practices Ban Bill, let us be mindful of the deep and lasting impact our decisions will have on the very fabric of family life, the sacred bond between parent and child. Just as we champion the protection of individuals from harmful practices, we must equally champion the rights of parents guiding their children and the freedom of religious practice. I urge my colleagues to consider these points carefully. The Liberals and Nationals will move amendments to the bill in a way that preserves these fundamental rights, ensuring a balanced and just approach that serves the best interests of our children, families and broader society. Just a few comments in closing. The consultation relating to this bill has been inadequate, deficient and quite simply lacking. It has been select and very exclusive. What we do know is that the consultation involved 150 organisations with 134 submissions and 8 round tables. Mr President, what people need to understand is that the consultation was held on grounds of strict confidence. Member organisations were prohibited to discuss any materials, any issues with their members. The consultation was narrow and not fit for purpose. The legislative process the government has followed regarding the bill has also been, quite frankly, shameful. The bill was referred by the Selection of Bills Committee to an inquiry. This bill is controversial and does have a significant impact upon our society. An inquiry would have taken less than 2 months and would have allowed stakeholders to be heard. What happened in this place on Tuesday this week when Labor, Greens, Animal Justice and the Cannabis Party united to put an axe through this inquiry was quite frankly a disgrace. The arguments presented as to why an inquiry was not needed were as ludicrous as they were offensive. A targeted consultation on the bill, as the government trumpeted, it's not a fair dinkum consultation. We know for a fact so many key stakeholders were ignored and given the mushroom treatment by an arrogant and contemptuous government. The Minns government has not acted in good faith. Schools, parent groups, this side of the House have been ignored. They're not interested in hearing views that don't accord with the outcome they desire. And this government has never articulated why this bill is so urgent and that they must forego a review on the impact of the legislation. Christian Schools Australia and the Australian Association of Christian Schools are amongst many that have been ignored and cut out of any consultation. Mr President, I note these associations represent 60,000 students in New South Wales. Christian schools and their communities hold great concern as to their ability to care and support young people under this bill. Let's be honest, this place sees fit to hold inquiries into all matter of policy issues. I, for example, am participating in an inquiry into dog pounds. From Inverell to Sydney, I've attended hearings, I've read submissions, I've engaged with the community. What this government and its left-wing allies are saying is, we'll have an inquiry and spend time and resources into a dog pound inquiry, but we will not hold one into the hugely controversial and contentious matter of gender conversion. Are they serious? It's absurd. The bill is hugely controversial. The government is focusing simply on getting the bill rushed through rather than what is best for the people of New South Wales. They are not interested in the views of the people of New South Wales. We had inquiries into contentious issues like euthanasia and abortion. Why not this issue? I have very grave concerns as to the government's bill, as I have spoken of tonight. I am also appalled by the government's arrogant and disingenuous attempt to ram this bill through and ignore community consultation. As I have discussed tonight, this side of the House has put up amendments in good faith to improve this rushed legislation. I call on the government and its Green Left allies to consider the amendments. After already rejecting an urgently needed inquiry into the bill, New South Wales families deserve to be heard.
Thank you. The Honourable Mark Latham.
Thank you, President. This bill is typical of the style of the Minns government. It's more interested in virtue signalling and divisive identity politics than real practical outcomes for the people of New South Wales. With regard to gay conversion practices, it's trying to ban something that as a medical service went out in the 1970s, along with flares and cardigans. The only real impact of the bill is on transgender, that is gender transition practices and medical support, and this is where most of the second reading debate is concentrated. Once exemptions are granted for parents, medicos and religions, as they are in this bill, theoretically it should be business as usual. But the insidious aspect of the bill is the way in which it weaponises lawfare, the identity left going outside democratic parliamentary processes to the courts, to silence and rub out its opponents under the weight of litigation costs. The New South Wales Government funds ACON with $13 million per annum. ACON was established to deal with the AIDS epidemic, which now thankfully has passed, so it has morphed into an alphabet monitoring, policing and lawfare body. If this bill is passed, it will try to intimidate anyone or any organisation questioning transgender with complaints to leftist human rights tribunals. They don't need to be credible complaints, as these tribunals need the work to stay open, so they accept them all on suspicion. Ultimately, the process becomes the punishment, running up legal costs to defend yourself, fearful of losing your home, ordinary citizens fearful of having to face a government tribunal. That's how so-called human rights are now run in New South Wales. For this reason alone, the bill should be opposed. The other problem with the bill is that it's banning the wrong practices. While internationally governments are banning gender transition and puberty blockers for under 18s, New South Wales is a backwater, still drinking the Kool-Aid of identity alphabet politics. Wise governments overseas, learning from the medical evidence and social experience of transgender, are heading in one direction, while the Minns government is heading in the other, opposite direction. As Chair of the Education Committee in the last term of Parliament, we conducted an inquiry into parental rights, which brought in a range of opinion on transgender in children, experts on both sides of the argument, and it was a very revealing inquiry with findings useful for the Parliament and certainly useful for each of the MPs who are on the committee. Yes, it's true, my judgment was that probably 10% of the childhood transgender experiences are real and lasting a lifetime. But the 90% remainder group were a mix of peer group pressure, autism, Asperger's, kids who were just plain lonely, longing for recognition and belonging, others in it for the prank, how do boys get into the girls' toilet? That's something that children and teenagers engage in, believe it or not, and fads, like many of the earlier fads that teenagers go through. So it was a mixture, but recognising that among that mixture, the 90%, these weren't permanent changes, and in many cases the reversal of them has been deeply damaging. In many cases, telling boys they can be girls and vice versa is a cruel practice, destroying families and children. The real harm comes when institutions try to take over the role of parents, and this is a feature. I've mentioned in this parliament the shameful training, so-called training video of the New South Wales Teachers Federation that has told teachers don't tell parents about these gender and sexuality issues in the children at school because it's not safe for the children to go home. Well, what a hide the Federation has to say that, to say it's not safe to go home when in the vast majority of cases the home is the most loving and stable and safe institution that can be found in our society. So the practices are out there, teachers, other education institutions, school counsellors and the like, trying to take over the role of parents and actively keeping parents in the dark, like that Teachers Federation so-called training seminar. I've had a range of constituent cases where if parents are kept in the dark, I can assure the House, no good ever comes from it. No good ever comes from it, as you'd logically expect. Parents were there at the beginning of the childhood experience. Love, care and devotion more than anyone else. Teachers come and go. They can go to another school. You don't see them again. They are essentially, despite a lot of their good work, strangers in our life. So keeping parents in the dark is the wrong practice. And the lesson is parents and families must come first. Parents must always be informed about important information concerning their children, whether academic, personal development or the matters the subject of this bill. We need to follow the international evidence and decision making. You look at the United Kingdom, for example, they went early into the trans ideology experience and now they're coming out of it. Why don't we learn from their experience instead of repeating the mistakes? In the UK, they've closed the Tavistock Gender Clinic, which clearly years ago ignored the evidence and report about the damage that was being caused. We have a similar institution in Newcastle called Maple Leaf House, where the Honourable Greg Donnelly, unfortunately absent tonight, has provided compelling evidence that it too has gone down the Tavistock pathway. In the United Kingdom, they've also banned puberty blockers for under 18s. So the New South Wales direction is 180 degrees in the wrong direction, and I'm opposing the bill for that reason. I draw to the House's attention probably the best summary I can find of what's happened in the United Kingdom in the Observer editorial in October of last year, and I quote, "There has been a welcome shift in the way the National Health Service England says it will provide care for children with gender dysphoria. In recent months, it's moved away from ideologically driven affirmation models that view gender dysphoria in children purely as a sign of fixed trans identity. It is instead adopting a more evidence-based approach, as laid out in the review by the distinguished paediatrician Dr Hilary Cass, that starts from the understanding that children's feelings of gender incongruence are often transient and fluid and can be associated with autism, childhood trauma, children grappling with their own developing same-sex attraction and intense discomfort about puberty." And as I mentioned earlier, these equate to the findings of our own Education Committee in the last term of Parliament. The editorial goes on. Accordingly, the NHS now says social transition, treating a child as though they are of the opposite sex, should only be considered in cases where there is significant clinical distress or impairment in social functioning. Puberty blocking drugs, the entry point of a medical pathway that can lead to cross-sex hormones and sex-change surgery, will only be prescribed as part of a clinical trial given fears about potential long-term impacts for bone and brain development, fertility and sexual functioning, and concerns they make permanent gender dysphoria that would otherwise naturally resolve itself. The watchful waiting, it's in inverted commas that term that's been used, but it's become the policy approach. The watchful waiting approach counsels that children should be allowed to experiment with identity with neither endorsement nor criticism for adults and access talking therapy that includes exploration of the reasons for gender distress. Further afield, looking at the American experience, in the United States, legislation regarding gender-affirming care largely exists at a state level. In March of 2023, 9 states had enacted legislative bans on gender-affirming care for youth and young adults. Some of these bans include medical interventions as well as surgery. These states are Georgia, Iowa, Tennessee, Mississippi, South Dakota, Utah, Alabama, Arizona and Arkansas. Florida and Texas have also restricted access to gender-affirming care for minors through their executive branches. In Europe, A number of countries have recently reviewed the evidence for and their approaches to gender-affirming care for minors. This has resulted in some countries placing stricter access requirements for hormones and puberty blockers for young people and requiring that these are only used in research settings. Countries where there have been reviews and revisions to guidelines and other requirements include Finland, Sweden, France, Norway, England and the Netherlands. And most of those countries, of course, would be known as socially progressive in their politics. So the time will come in New South Wales where we too learn these experiences and act on them. Why we don't do that right now, given the international experience where the tide has turned, is one of the great frustrations of our politics. We are a backwater in terms of the understanding of these issues. We're not learning from the international experience, and for that and the other reasons I've outlined, I oppose the bill, but if there are supporting amendments, of course, they would receive endorsement.
Madam President?
The Honourable Tony Mihalik.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to obviously indicate my opposition to the bill. I think it's very interesting that every time we have one of these types of pieces of legislation, they tend to be conducted with great urgency and always in the very late hour, some would say ungodly hours, and of course the proper deliberation that you need to have for this type of legislation doesn't end up happening. I remember my experiences with the abortion debate and of course euthanasia, and now likewise in regards to conversion practices ban bill. I do want to note with a little bit of interest, I've deliberately stayed here for the entire debate because I've wanted to listen to everybody's contribution, and I also watched the debate in the other chamber. I note with great interest that not many, despite it being a government bill, not many members of the government are in fact making a contribution to this legislation here in this chamber, nor did many, and only a dozen, in the other house. I note with great interest that specific areas didn't make, I note the member for Bankstown and Strathfield and Cabramatta and Fairfield and many parts of southwest Sydney, those Labor MPs did not make a contribution to the debate. Interestingly, neither did the member for Rockdale, the Minister for Multiculturalism. And of great note, I want to mention that the Premier himself did not make a contribution into this debate. I thought that was very interesting. He is the Premier, of course, of the state, and he announced prior to the election that he would introduce this legislation, but at the end he was absent from making any contribution whatsoever into this debate. I remember during the abortion debate, he was the one and only MP who voted for abortion but chose not to speak and give his view on that debate, which was interesting back then. I guess that was probably a good indication of how he stands on issues, or in fact maybe not stand on certain issues. So we don't really know what the Premier's real view on this legislation is, because he hasn't put it firmly on record, other than the fact that he was prepared to use his office and his particular ministers, and Chief Lieutenant, I think, Minister for Multiculturalism, Steve Camper, was set out to speak to the religious groups, to massage them through this legislation, and essentially be told that they really had no option but to agree to this legislation, because otherwise Alex Greenidge's bill would be pursued, and it was far worse, or potentially other legislation mirroring the Victorian legislation would be pursued instead. So there's been a lot of different discussions had, in fact, behind closed doors, some of which has come back to people like myself and other members of this House. And I would have to say that some of these religious groups were in fact held to ransom, threatened with the idea that the Equality Bill would be put through to this place, or, as I said, that more draconian legislation would be introduced instead, or passed in this House. So there was a comment made by the Honourable Chris Rath that no credible religious group has asked that any party oppose this legislation. And I'll say this in relation to that. A lot of discussions took place behind closed doors. Sadly, they have been behind closed doors. Many religious groups have not even had any consultation whatsoever. A number of faith groups that I know of certainly were not consulted with. And when the move to have an inquiry was put forward, there was a comment made that about 150 stakeholders were consulted with, and there was no need to have an inquiry. There was a reason why the government didn't want to have that inquiry, and that's because it would have exposed that many groups, in fact, were not consulted with, and more so, many religious groups did raise a whole plethora of issues that this government chose to keep behind closed doors rather than in the open and transparent manner that I think these type of very critical issues should be discussed in the public realm. For the record, I must say I don't actually oppose gay. I don't oppose gay. Sorry, I should say I do oppose. I apologise. It's laid out. I do oppose gay conversion practices, and I've listened with sensitivity to some of the stories here tonight, where members have relayed terrible stories of people's experiences from the 1960s and 70s. Some of these horrible experiences of electro shock therapy and physical abuse and indeed harassment that some people have experienced in relation to that, and I'm deeply sorry that they've experienced that. Equally, I don't want to see children dealing with gender dysphoria being mistreated either. I don't want families being marginalised and maligned by this type of legislation and tearing each other apart. I don't want them to suffer either. Sometimes when you try to right a wrong, you're actually creating further problems, and I hope this legislation down the track doesn't cause further issues for third-party and health care professionals, for pastoral carers, for extended family members and others that might be there to help families manage through very difficult times. And there are issues now before families that perhaps weren't there many, many years ago. And I refer specifically to gender dysphoria and the issues of gender identity, where there are far more numbers of people coming forward with these issues, and indeed families are having to navigate through very difficult times where parental rights are being eroded, and it indeed places an immense amount of stress. And I also, if I can, refer to many multicultural communities that face a very difficult time in navigating through the type of laws that exist in Australia, where children are essentially told from a very young age that you can do what you like, and you don't need to concern yourself with parental authority. And indeed, what you may see is extended family members being subjected to really unfair proceedings as a result of just simply trying to assist their loved ones in navigating these very challenging times the families or challenging experiences these families might face. The Conversion Practices Ban Bill, in my belief, is a dangerous piece of legislation for the reasons that I've said. And I think it also, unfortunately, normalises radical gender ideology, and it erodes religious freedom, and it's a grievous attack on freedom of speech. Given the lifelong medical consequences associated with affirming a person's gender identity, it's preposterous to effectively disallow counselling or behavioural therapy for people with gender dysphoria directed at helping them be happy in their body they're already in, rather than insisting they change it with cosmetic surgeries and powerful life-altering drugs. In short, the bill is a Trojan horse for radical gender theory and only benefits ideologues with vested political interests in seeing it being passed. I also think the bill goes much further than the realm of just gender identity and indeed sexual orientation. It does usurp parental rights, it does encroach into religious freedom, and it effectively isolates individuals and families and leaves them bereft of being able to access appropriate third-party health care and other alternative care. That's what it essentially does. It will essentially isolate people. The language of the bill is hopelessly, of course, vague, and I want to quote the LGB Alliance, who stated conversion practices have been refined to reflect the ideological and financial interests of gender advocates by elevating gender over or substituting it for biological sex in law. This is a critical point. The bill conflates sex and gender. Sex is one's biological and unchangeable sex, male or female, and gender identity is how one identifies socially, man, woman, or if you're that way inclined, seemingly infinite genders in between. However, the bill defines gender identity as the gender-related identity of an individual, which may or may not correspond with the individual's designated sex at birth. This nonsensical conflation of sex and gender is a deliberate attempt to erode the distinction between the two, which is part of the agenda of radical gender activists, to eliminate sex-based rights. And of course this will have an effect on women and on children, and indeed gay and lesbian and bisexual people. Now, how can the New South Wales government expect to legislate on gender identity when they can't even define it correctly? The bill only mentions parents as exempt from being accused of enacting conversion practices when discussing matters of sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual activity or religion with their children. This wilfully ignores the full scope of people who care for children, indeed grandparents and aunties and uncles and older siblings and godparents and cousins and pastoral carers and indeed family friends. This bill also proves how hopelessly behind the rest of the world, of course Australia, is when it comes to the dangers of the so-called gender-affirming care. More and more countries around the world are waking up to the fact that giving children and teens puberty blockers and double mastectomies is doing more harm than good. Most recently, the NHS in the UK has banned the prescription of puberty blockers to children and young teenagers. They stated, we have, and I quote, "We have concluded that there is not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty blockers to make the treatment routinely available at this time." And credit to the UK for making this very strong position. It's also said that drugs would be able to be prescribed only as part of clinical trials. The NHS has effectively acknowledged that children have been used as lab rats by unscrupulous activist adults in a worldwide experiment to see how far they can erode the boundaries of gender. Additionally, in July last year, 21 researchers and clinicians from 9 different countries, Finland, the UK, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, France, Switzerland, South Africa and the USA, signed a letter to the Wall Street Journal stating that, and I quote, "the best available evidence does not support the notion that medical gender-affirming care is the best thing for the well-being of trans people, nor does it reduce the risk of suicide." According to these researchers and clinicians, every systemic review of evidence to date, including one published in the Journal of the Endocrine Society, has found the evidence for mental health benefits of hormonal interventions for minors to be of low or very low certainty. By contrast, the risks are significant and includes sterility, lifelong dependence on medication, and the anguish of regret. They also asserted that this is why increasing numbers of European countries and international professional organisations are now recommending psychotherapy instead of hormones and surgeries as the first line of treatment for young people suffering from gender dysphoria. And I note last year, the Honourable Steve Lawrence and a number of us attended a meeting that the Honourable Greg Donnelly had organised with parents of children who were going through transition and some of the anguish that they were experiencing and some of the terrible side effects that their children were experiencing, both mental and physical side effects. And we met with a young woman, Jay Lagardinis, who I'm sure many have heard about her. She saw a psychiatrist in 2010 at the age of 19, believing she had gender dysphoria and identifying as a man. Dr. Tui at the time found she was suitable for testosterone therapy, and she came back to him in 2012, this time wanting a double mastectomy, and he affirmed her decision. And the next month she wanted a hysterectomy, and he again affirmed her decision. She underwent these procedures, believing that it would help her mental well-being, and of course it did the exact opposite. Ultimately, she clearly regretted these surgeries and deeply regretted the complications that resulted from these surgeries: depression, anxiety, complications from early menopause, impaired psychological functioning, diminished capacity for employment, and ongoing need for lifelong and permanent medical treatment. She subsequently is sued for professional negligence, and currently alleges, and I quote, that doctor should have ought to have known that she needed further psychiatric evaluation and assistance. So there are many, many examples where this type of transition goes wrong, and in meeting some of these parents, as we did that afternoon in Parliament, you could see that they needed they were trying to find other avenues of ways of assisting their children, and some of their children were under 18, some were older than 18. But in the end, the examples that we met, or the people that we met that day, they were clearly regretting the decision of their transition, and they were clearly also quite grateful to their parents and the extended family, and indeed friends and healthcare professionals that ultimately did assist them in trying to help determine what their actual help that they needed or assistance they ultimately needed, because clearly a number of them, in this example Jay, regretted the decisions that she undertook in having those surgeries. And so my concern, of course, and I've got a couple of amendments, and I want to acknowledge that I've seen the Liberal Party amendments, and I certainly indicate that I'll support them. There's some very good amendments, and I've chosen not to repeat those amendments in what I've put forward. The Shooters have some fantastic amendments as well, and I have a few amendments where I'm trying to also raise a couple of issues. One, I think it's just imperative that the Act not be apply to any family members or extended or near relatives or any healthcare officials or pastoral carers that a parent might seek to provide assistance for children, firstly under the age of 18 and also under the age of 16. So I've provided two different amendments in that regard. But I also think it's important that if consent is withdrawn at some stage, if an individual consents for a certain type of assistance or guidance or care or counselling, that should they withdraw that consent, that it's imperative that none of, at some stage during that treatment or assistance or guidance, that it's important that what transpired in that period of consent is not actually used against them in proceedings down the track. And I think that's important that type of amendment be moved and supported in this House as well. So that's another amendment that I'll be putting forward. So lastly, I just want to close to thank the many people that have emailed my office, and I thank them for their terrific examples. I should note one particular email. One wonderful lady gave the example that you wouldn't actually condemn a parent for stopping their child from wanting to have a tattoo, because of course they're illegal under the age of 18. But now you can't do anything. You can't condemn them should their child want to have a puberty blocker or take hormonal treatment. So that was a very interesting example. But of course it has been used in the past in the media as well. That example that ironically having a tattoo or getting a tattoo is illegal for kids under 18, but of course having these puberty blockers or undertaking hormonal treatment is not illegal under 18. It's absurd. Absolutely absurd, but a very good example and comparison. So I just wanted to, again, thank everybody for their emails, thank the Women's Forum also for some of the information they've provided, to the Australian Association of Christian Schools that have also written to my office, and I'm sure they've written to other MPs, to the faith leaders who put together their particular amendments that they would like to put through this House. So I thank them for their contribution. I do note again there are only a limited number of leaders that have signed that letter. But again, that's reflective in the fact that I think many faith groups were not actually consulted with by the government. So it's not a reflection on those particular faith leaders, but it's disappointing to see that only about 5 groups there have signed that letter. They were the groups that the Honourable Damien Tudorhope referred to earlier in his speech that have asked us to consider further amendments, despite the fact that they've already undertaken months of consultation with the government behind closed doors. So, Madam President, I again indicate that I will be opposing this bill at every stage tonight.
The Honourable Eileen McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Excuse me. My preference would have been to take the time to get this right and for it to have been done at a decent hour. I remain concerned the role of parents and carers appears to be diminished in this bill. Parents and carers have an unbreakable bond with their children, yet this bill, as it stands, seems to imply their viewpoint is less worthy. Any intended or unintended consequence of marginalising parents is a backward step. Families are not flawless, but they have been the bedrock of a functioning society that overwhelmingly loves and protects its children. The bill in its present form risks overreach. It proposes blunt regulations that doesn't allow for the many nuances of conversations and support children may receive as they navigate adolescence and early adulthood. This bill is asking the state and bureaucracy to step into the shoes of parenting and care. We have seen how miserably that can go astray when we decide governments know best. I'll keep it very short now. The debate is an opportunity to improve the bill, and I urge members to consider the opposition's amendments on their merit.
Thank you. Further speakers? No, the Minister in reply.
Thank you. I thank everyone for their contributions to this debate. The Honourable Damien Tudorhope, the Honourable Amanda Conn, the Honourable Stephen Lawrence, the Honourable Natasha McLaren-Jones, the Honourable Mark Banasiak, the Honourable Susan Carter, the Honourable Kate Fairman, the Honourable Jackie Munro, the Honourable Rod Roberts, the Honourable Chris Rath, the Honourable Emma Hurst, the Honourable Rachel Merton, the Honourable Mark Latham, the Honourable Tanya Mihalik, and the Honourable Eileen McDonald. I would like to address some of the matters during the debate on this bill. This bill has been the subject of significant consultation that was extensive and carefully considered. Almost 150 organisations were engaged in the consultation work last year, including people with lived experience, representatives from LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, faith-based organisations, parents' rights groups, gender advocacy organisations, and legal, government, education and health stakeholders. These stakeholders were not limited to those initially identified by the government working group leading the reform, but they also included other organisations nominated by the initial cohort as having relevant expertise or interest in the reforms. The confidentiality of the process sought to facilitate frank discussion and contributions from stakeholders on polarising issues. Some members may have specifically named stakeholders who they say were not consulted. In fact, many of these stakeholders did make contributions as part of the significant consultation process that informed the policy positions behind the bill. Indeed, in addition to the 150 direct consultations, there was also 134 submissions that were made. This bill does strike the right balance in prohibiting harmful and objectionable practices while also respecting civil liberties such as the freedom of expression and, importantly, the freedom of religious belief. The government has never intended to ban religious teachings or the expression of religious beliefs through sermon. The religious exclusion at Clause 3, Subclause 3, Paragraph C, ensures that expressions of belief or principles such as prayer and sermon are not to be banned where they are not directed to change or suppress sexual orientation or gender identity. The bill also explicitly provides that stating what relevant religious teachings are and what a religion says about a specific topic are examples of what does not constitute a conversion practice. The bill also strikes the right balance in continuing to allow for the provision of clinically appropriate health care to LGBTQ+ people. The bill does not mandate any treatment. This bill makes it clear
that a health service or treatment that is delivered by a registered health practitioner that the health practitioner has assessed as clinically appropriate in their reasonable professional judgment and complies with relevant professional, legal and ethical requirements is not a conversion practice. The bill does not prevent a clinician from deciding what treatment to provide to an individual patient based on their reasonable clinical judgment. It also does not prevent advice being given to a patient about the impacts of any proposed treatment. The bill also appropriately recognises the rights of parents to support their children and their needs when exploring their identity and values. Clause 3.6, subclause 3, paragraph B, provides that genuinely facilitating an individual's coping skills development or identity exploration to meet the individual's needs is not a conversion practice. This includes providing acceptance, support or understanding. The bill also explicitly notes that parental discussions are not captured by the bill, and the drafting of the definition of conversion practices means that rules of general application, such as household rules, are not targeted to changing or suppressing an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity are not conversion practices. The bill also does not prevent a person from seeking support or guidance. What it does prevent is the provision of a practice, treatment or sustained effort to change or suppress an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. I would like to specifically address Mr Banasiak's concerns about the subjective application to the use of the term substantial harm when determining whether a conversion practice has taken place. Substantial harm already exists in the New South Wales Statute Book in the context of both aggravating or mitigating factors in Section 21A of the Crimes Sentencing Procedure Act 1999. Courts have held that substantial harm means harm that is not trivial, transient or trifling. Madam Deputy President, I do want to make just one further comment that was raised in a lot in the discussion tonight, and it is about the role of parents and the importance of parents in children's lives. I don't think there's anyone in this House who doesn't understand how important that is. One of the people who have not, many people who have not had a lot of airing of their views is actually the parents of trans children. Parents of trans children work extremely hard to support and love their children. They take them to many appointments. It is a very long and complicated process. You are often dealing with children who are in a lot of distress. The point of the care that they get is it's the care that they need to keep them alive. It is that important. There is no suggestion here that parents can't speak with their children and work through that. But the only point that I'd make finally in this debate on relation to this matter, and also to some degree for people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual, is that these traits are sometimes where you find yourself, unlike other traits that you join in your family, whether it's where you live, whether it's the religion that you have, whether it's the sexuality or the gender of the family that you live in, you are sometimes completely alone. And these are the kind of things where you do have a change in the way in which we try to manage that and try to protect these very precious people in our community from harm. Finally, I just want to put on the record my thanks to the many, many faith groups and leaders who have truly engaged with this process. Some suggestion, I think, in the debate was that hasn't occurred. It is just not the case. There has been a huge amount of consultation, and I know that the government has appreciated greatly the thoughtful way in which people have engaged with this process, the way that they've struggled with genuinely difficult issues in terms of where you draw the balance in relation to these matters. I particularly want to thank some of the faith leaders who have encouraged us to support this bill very strongly, because they have seen what it's meant for the people in their congregations and how important this is. I also want to thank Equality Australia for their ongoing wisdom and advice. As ever, we don't agree on everything, but we do agree on a fair amount, and I think that this bill is better as a result of their input. I also want to thank the survivors, particularly, many of them have been mentioned tonight, but ones who seriously engaged with this: Anthony Venn Brown, Chris Cabbs, Tim Pocock, Jeremy Smith, Aaron Kelly, Ace, Teddy Cook, Dawn Empson-Howe, Nathan Despot, Eamon McCone, yes, and McCann, thank you for the pronunciation, and Rachel. But I also wanted to put a shout out to the many public servants across the various portfolios in government, with both in the Attorney General's and DCJ, but also within health in particular. This is different. These issues are difficult, and there is difficult law to be had, and there are very strong views in relation to that. But there has been a very, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of work that's gone in to get to this place. I particularly want to have a shout out to my colleagues, the Minister for Multiculturalism, the Minister for Health and the Attorney General for the work that they and their staff have diligently done over a long period of time to get to where we are tonight. The government is really proud of this bill. We think that it gets the balance right. We believe that it values and ensures that everyone in this state understands that they are valued no matter who they are, no matter who they love, or no matter the body that they were born into. We also understand that people have a right to freedom of expression and to their religious faith, and we have deep conviction and understanding of that. To suggest otherwise is just simply incorrect. Many of the people who are asking for this change are people of faith, people of deep faith, who have experienced harmful practices, some in the distant past, some literally happening right now. We cannot pretend that this is something that is something in the distant past or that it is not happening. But the point here tonight is that there's been a very long discussion, and I know that we've got a mountain of amendments to deal with. The government has considered the amendments as we've seen them on the way through, and I will outline our position in relation to these. But I really do want to commend the bill to the House. I want to thank those that are involved, and I want to thank and remember those who are not here to see it pass.
Thank you. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells.